So there you have the physics. The next part is the popular narrative and its political origins. Here is the currently popular narrative concerning this system. The climate, a complex multi-factor system, can be summarized in just one variable, the globally average temperature change, and is primarily controlled by the 1 to 2% perturbation in the energy budget due to a single variable, carbon dioxide, among many variables of comparable importance. Now, I would suggest this is an extraordinary pair of claims right off the bat. It's based on reasoning that borders on magical thinking. And yet it is the narrative that has been widely accepted even among many skeptics. Now, it goes further. Many politicians and learned societies endorse CO2 as the controlling variable, and although mankind's contributions are small compared to much larger but uncertain natural exchanges of CO2 with both the oceans and biosphere. Biosphere means plant life on Earth. We're confident that we know precisely what policies to implement in order to control CO2. I don't know what one says about this. I mean, it's true over the last 200 years, several scientists have put forward similar views, but until the 1980s, what you may not realize is whenever these were suggested, they were dismissed with perfectly good arguments. It wasn't as though everyone said, aha, or they forgot. There were reasons they rejected. In 1988, when the NASA scientist James Hansen testified to the US Senate that summer's warmth reflected increasing CO2, even Science magazine, which is highly biased these days, reported that the climate science community was skeptical. The establishment of this extreme position as dogma during the present period, I would suggest, as Nigel said, is due to political actors and others seeking to exploit opportunities that abound in the multi-trillion-dollar energy sector. There are numerous examples of this, but I'll point to two that I sort of like, and they were very important. One example was a man called Maurice Strong. Some of you may know the name. He was a global bureaucrat and wheeler-dealer. He spent his final years in China apparently trying to avoid prosecution for his role in the UN's oil for food scandals. At any rate, Strong is frequently credited with initiating the global warming movement in the early 80s. I'm not sure that's correct, as I'll point out, but he did play the major role in engineering the conference, the Rio Conference in 1991, that produced the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this was the agreement that virtually every nation, including my own, signed, essentially endorsing the CO2 climate narrative, and it initiated the series of international meetings, the COP meetings, that continue to the present, and these meetings presumably are designed to plan the control of climate. They could be called the Canute meetings, but there were others who played a major role as well. One of them was the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme and his friend and science advisor Bert Bolin. Bert Bolin was the first chairman of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they already in the 1970s were pushing an anti-carbon movement. Their motivation was to overcome resistance to nuclear energy by demonizing coal, and to a certain extent, Maggie Thatcher also was attracted to this view. The trouble is the political enthusiasm has only increased since then, and political ideology has come to play a major role. I'll only go through this briefly. I mean, you have things like the Christiana Figueres, who was executive secretary of the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change that I mentioned earlier. And she looked at this as the means for intentionally changing the world's economic system. Pope Francis' closest advisor, Cardinal Oscar Rodriguez Maradiaga, criticized movements in the US that had preemptively come out in opposition to Francis' planned encyclical on climate change. And his quote was, "The ideology surrounding environmental issues is too tied to a capitalism that doesn't want to stop ruining the environment because they don't want to give up their profits." And this extends to the proceedings of my National Academy of Sciences, which, alas, I'm a member of. And they had a typical paper recently, I think last August. Typical of these papers, we'll come back to that with the IPCC. There was an article, and we'll see with these articles, they're just littered with could-bes and would-bes and so on. I think lawyers would call this plausible deniability. But then they concluded that collective human action is required to steer the Earth system away from a potential threshold and keep it habitable. I love this constant mixing of the required and the potential. The authors said that this would involve stewardship of the entire Earth system, biosphere, climate, and societies, and that it might involve decarbonization of the global economy, enhancement of biosphere carbon sinks, behavioral changes, technological innovations, new governance arrangements, and transformed social values. That's quite a package. But remember, in a world that buys into the incoherent precautionary principle, even the mere claim of remote possibility justifies extreme action. I think this is dangerous in many areas, not just in science. But the question is, what are they seeking? And I would argue that what is happening, and I don't know if it's true in England, but I feel this strongly in the States, where the left and the regulatory states backed by the wealthiest people in America. And you have this odd thing where the left in the US is now the wealthy, the middle class and working classes are the right, and then when you get to the classes that are on welfare, they're back on the left. And I have the feeling that the people who are pushing this issue are desperately seeking the power to roll back the status and welfare that ordinary people have acquired and continue to acquire through the fossil fuel-generated industrial revolution, and return them to their presumably more appropriate status as serfs. Many more among the world's poorest will be forbidden the opportunity to improve their condition. And I think that's a serious thing. Nevertheless, when you present these claims that I've just mentioned to the leaders of our societies and governments, along with the bogus, utterly bogus claim that 97% of scientists agree, our leaders are afraid to differ and proceed lemming-like to plan for the suicide of industrial society. Now, interestingly, ordinary people, as opposed to the educated elites, tend to see through this nonsense. And the question is, what is it about our elites that make them so vulnerable? And what is it about many of our scientists that lead them to promote such foolishness? I would suggest the answers cannot be very flattering. So let's look at this. When you consider the vulnerable elites first thing I would point out, and I think this is true everywhere, they've been educated in a system where success has been predicated on their ability to please their professors. In other words, they have been conditioned to rationalize anything. Orwell, I think, made the point there are some things so stupid only an intellectual could believe them. You've been on to something. The second is, while they are vulnerable to false narratives, they are far less economically vulnerable than ordinary people, and they believe themselves wealthy enough to withstand the economic pain of the proposed policies, and they are clever enough to often benefit from them. Third thing that I think is important is the narrative is trivial enough for the elite to finally think that they understand science. I'll come back to that in a moment. And for many, especially I think on the right part of the political spectrum, the need to be regarded as intelligent causes them to fear that opposing anything claimed to be scientific might make them appear ignorant. And this fear overwhelms any ideological commitment to liberty and free markets that they might have. Again, none of this applies to ordinary people, and I would suggest this may well be the strongest argument for popular democracy and against the leadership of those who, quote, know best. Now, what about the scientists? First of all, scientists are specialists. Few, very few, are expert in climate. This includes many so-called climate scientists who became climate scientists in response to the huge increases in funding that accompanied global warming hysteria. One essentially did something that even Stalin couldn't quite succeed in doing with Lysenko. We've actually created a huge new community in a field based solely on a political position. The funding, for those of you who haven't followed it, in the US at least, I don't know, I'm pretty sure it was almost the same in England, in the early 90s, increased by a factor of 15. There are almost no sciences that can absorb that, so you create new ones. This also led to the issue of impacts, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But it means, even if you never studied climate, if you studied cockroaches and you wrote the proposal, Cockroaches and Climate, or how they'll increase, there was funding for you. Okay. Now, the other thing is scientists have political positions. And it's been tempting. Many have been enthusiastic about using their status as scientists to promote their political positions. This is not unlike celebrities whose status I think a lot of scientists aspire to. As examples, again, I don't know if they fit the UK, but in the US, you had huge movements within the scientific community against nuclear weapons, against the Strategic Defense Initiative, against the Vietnam War, and so on and so forth. Okay, I think scientists are also acutely and cynically aware of the ignorance of non-scientists and the fear that this engenders. The fear leaves the vulnerable elites particularly relieved by assurances that the theory underlying the alarm is trivially simple and that all scientists agree. My favorite on this is our former Secretary of State, my former Senator, John F. Kerry, when he stated with reference to greenhouse warming, quote, "I know sometimes I can remember from when I was in high school and college, some aspects of chemistry or physics can be tough, but this is not tough. This is simple. Kids at the earliest age can understand this," end quote. Have you seen the greenhouse effect is not all that simple. I would suggest only remarkably brilliant kids would understand it. And given Kerry's subsequent description of climate and its underlying physics, it was clear he was not among them. At any rate, so we have this. Now we come to the evidence, which you're besieged with on a daily basis. You might be wondering at this stage, and I say the underwhelming evidence, what about all this evidence for climate change? What about disappearing Arctic ice, the rising sea level, the weather extremes, the starving polar bears, the Syrian civil war, and all the rest of it? The vast variety of claims makes it impossible to point to any particular fault that applies to all of them. Of course, citing the existence of changes, even if correct, though surprisingly often not, would not implicate global greenhouse warming per se. And, often the connection is not there. Nor would it point to danger. Moreover, most of the so-called evidence refers to matters for which you have no personal experience. Some of the claims, such as those referring to weather extremes, contradict both physical theory and data. The purpose of the claims is quite obvious. It is to frighten and befuddle the public and to make it seem like there is evidence where there is in fact none. First, logically, for something to be evidence, it must have been unambiguously predicted so that it is a test that can be failed. This isn't a sufficient condition, but it is necessary. Now, I have a figure here which illustrates how silly this can be. What this figure does is show the IPCC model forecast for the summer minimum in Arctic sea ice in the year 2100 relative to the period 1980 to 2000. So they're saying, how much is it going to go down from that period? And each of these curves is a different model. I don't have a pointer here, but that's okay. And what you can see is, don't worry, for 2100, there are models predicting anything from complete elimination to almost none. That's great. That's really great. If, there is a model for any outcome. It's a little like the formula for being an expert marksman. Shoot first and declare whatever you hit to be the target. So, that's one form of argumentation that one has to deal with. Now, when it comes to temperature extremes, is there any data to even support concern? And here you have something interesting, because I'll come to that with today's release. The data shows no trend in extremes. On top of that, the IPCC agrees the data shows no trend in extremes. Even a man called Gavin Schmidt, who is the successor to James Hansen at NASA's New York shop, remarked that general statements about extremes are almost nowhere to be found in the literature, but seem to abound in the popular media. He went on to say that it takes only a few seconds' thought to realize that the popular perceptions that global warming means all extremes have to increase all the time is nonsense. Why is it nonsense? Well, a lot of reasons. At the heart of this nonsense is the failure to distinguish weather from climate. Thus, global warming refers to the welcome warming of about 1 degree centigrade since the Little Ice Age about 200 years ago. On the other hand, weather extremes involve temperature changes on the order of 20 degrees centigrade over short periods of time, one day, hours. Such large changes which characterize weather have a profoundly different origin from global warming. The large changes, crudely speaking, result from winds carrying warm and cold air from distant regions that are very warm or very cold. You look at a map and you see temperature changing north to south, and you see the wind systems traveling around in the usual cyclonic and anticyclonic phases. Okay, so essentially these waves, the strength of the wind in these waves, depends on the temperature difference between the tropics and the pole, okay? And what do the modelers claim? They claim in a warmer world, the poles will warm more than the tropics. what will that do to the difference? It'll reduce the difference. So the waves, instead of getting stronger, will get weaker. And their ability to carry air from cold and warm regions to where you are will diminish. And so if you were to see an increasing number of extreme temperature events, what would that be evidence for? It would be evidence for global cooling. Now, this is, this is the physics underlying it. The trouble is, people who are not scientifically literate and who do not like to think about it seem incapable of distinguishing global warming from temperature extremes due to weather. Fortunately or unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be any discernible trend in weather extremes, but there is certainly greater attention paid by the media to weather, and the exploitation of this, quote, news coverage by people who realize that projections of catastrophe into the distant future are not compelling. You therefore need to convince the public that the danger is immediate, even if it isn't. Now, this has also been the case with sea level rise. Sea level has been increasing about 8 inches, 6 inches a century for hundreds of years. We have clearly been able to deal with it. In order to promote fear, however, those models that predict much larger increases are invoked. As a practical matter, it has long been known that in most coastal station locations, changes in sea level are measured, when measured by tide gauges, are primarily due to changes in land level, both tectonic and land usage. Okay, so sea level is another case where you just misrepresent things. Now, the small changes in global mean temperature, or temperature change, is often used as the evidence. I went back to the standard narrative. But even there's something really peculiar. If you look at the temperature change, even during the period 1978 to 1998, and you assume all of it is due to man, and then say, how sensitive is the climate? You'd end up saying that climate, in all likelihood, is not very sensitive. Moreover, the UN IPCC didn't say all of it. It said most of it, could be 51%, which point you're really down to something you wouldn't worry about. Does this matter? No, of course not. When politicians read that as the iconic statement of the IPCC in my country, Senators McCain and Lieberman said, now we have the smoking gun. We must do something. That scientists can say something that means it's not a big problem and assume that the politicians will say it means that it is proof of coming disaster, we have a problem. Then there is the issue of cherry picking, and I'm almost through. For instance, there's recently been a claim that Greenland ice discharge is increasing, and this is probably going to be increased by global warming. So be it. On the other hand, they omit to mention the report by both NOAA, our weather service, and the Danish Meteorological Institute, that has a special interest in Greenland, that the ice mass of Greenland has been increasing. Are these contradictory? Not necessarily. After all, increasing ice on an ice sheet pushes peripheral ice into the ocean. So both could be true, but if you leave out half, you don't have quite the picture. Okay, so where are we? Misrepresentation, exaggeration, cherry picking, or outright lying pretty much covers all the evidence. So we reach a conclusion. There you have it. I mean, implausible conjecture, backed by false evidence, or less kindly, fake news, and repeated incessantly, has become politically correct knowledge, and it is being used to promote the overturn of industrial civilization. What we will be leaving our grandchildren is not a planet damaged by industrial progress, but a record of unfathomable silliness, as well as a landscape degraded by rusting wind farms and decaying solar panel arrays. False claims about 90%, 97% agreement will not spare us, but the willingness of science to keep mum is likely to much reduce trust and support for science. And perhaps this won't be such a bad thing after all, certainly as concerns official science. There's at least one positive aspect to the present situation. None of the proposed policies will have much impact on greenhouse gases. Thus, we will continue to benefit from the one thing that can clearly be attributed to elevated carbon dioxide, that is, namely, its effective role as a plant fertilizer and a reducer of the drought vulnerability of plants. Meanwhile, today, the IPCC is claiming that we need to prevent another 0.5 degree centigrade of warming, since the 1 degree centigrade that has occurred so far has been accompanied by the greatest increase in human welfare in history. As we used to say in my childhood home of the Bronx, go figure. Thank you.